her presentation. Alexa has a PhD from Stanford University, which is the place where I got my doctorate also. And she is a professor at George Washington University, professor of English, and she has been deeply involved in editing. And I think we're going to hear something about that today. So, Alexa.
Thank you, Ross, for having me. It's an honor to address the Folger group. Today, I'm going to talk about editing King Lear for global inclusion. Specifically, it is the King Lear edition that Michael Best and I brought out recently. This is based on the Internet Shakespeare edition, the ISE. This book really is Michael Best's brainchild, from ISE to print. So I wanted to start with some concepts about editing critical editions now. Sonia Masai, for example, has observed that editors have considered early modern playbooks as socialized texts since the 1980s, because these texts bear the marks left on them by their use in the theater. So when we speak of early modern plays, invariably there's this connection, deep connection to performance practices, both early modern and modern. And this is one feature that we wanted to highlight. And this is an element of the play text that we wanted to honor. One thing about King Lear, of course, is that there are many different early modern texts and a lot of variants. Now, are variant errors, printer errors? John Jowett believes that the chief purpose of editing is to emancipate Shakespeare from what he calls the kingdom of error. Errors accrued during the transmission of the text from stage to page. We don't think variants are necessarily just errors or typos, if you will, but rather they are opportunities for open interpretations of the text. And I think that's what makes our edition unique. That's what makes studying early modern play text exciting. So the variants are valuable. Sonia Masai recently, when speaking on critical editing, says that early modern print culture formed rather than deformed Shakespeare. Even errors most obviously caused by the misfunctioning of hand press technology, they can generate suggestive cognitive readings. Let us look at an example that highlights the value of variants. If you look at through line number 145, this is where Lear tells Ken the bow is bent and drawn, make from the shaft. And Kent says that let it fall, rather, though the fork invade the region of my heart, be Kent unmannerly when Lear is mad. There are some interesting variants here between the Folio text and the Quarto. The Folio says when Lear is mad, the Quarto tells us when Lear is man. Well, Lear is both king and man, and so if you privilege the reading of man, then you will be thinking of, for example, the king's two bodies. This typesetter's innocent mistake actually opens up some of the interpretive possibilities. So I wanted to showcase some special features of the broad view edition of King Lear. First of all, we emphasize textual and performative variants. This edition is based on the extended text of 1623 Folio, while drawing also on 1608 Quarto. Essentially, we're trying to replicate the mouse over experience. When you go to Internet Shakespeare editions, you mouse over, you'll be able to see the variants, and we are replicating that in print form. I'll soon show you some examples. And I wrote an extensive global performance history of King Lear as well to emphasize not just the variants in text, but many different ways that actors can embody these words and the concepts and the motifs. The 1608 Quarto, as many of you know, is based on a performance at Whitehall in 1606. So it has roots in performance. The 1623 Folio also has roots in performance. It is likely edited by actors, even though it doesn't come directly from a specific performance. And so the variants, therefore, are not errors, but gateways to interpretive richness. And we interpret and incorporate variants within an ecology of printed words. And within this ecology, we will see traces of early modern and modern uses of display text. So let us begin with the Internet Shakespeare edition. Here is an example of how the ISE treated variants. If you look at, if you mouse over, you will get things such as Q1 first. And you would also have whole passages that are not in the Quarto that's highlighted, so that you would know which part to skip if you decide to stay with one particular edition. So mouse over reveals textual variants, and if you click on some underlined words, you can see interpreted annotations as well. On the ISE website, if you go to King Lear, you will be able to see, for instance, the famous opening scene of Division of the Kingdom, where King Lear says that we shall express our darker purpose. Give me the map there. Know that we have divided in three our kingdom, and 'tis our fast intent to shake all cares and business from our age. Now, there are some variants here. In Quarto, for instance, it's not fast intent, but first intent. And so I'm going to now show you how we replicate this mouse over experience in print. If you look at this excerpt, it's actually marked out on the margin to tell you this line, our fast intent, could be our first intent. And we're not trying to privilege one over the other or make some executive editorial decisions. Instead, we wanted this to be a toolbox for students with all the possibilities. Sometimes with the light in the so-called Freudian slip that's perhaps caused unintentionally by typesetters. Sometimes these variants could open up new ways to interpret a particular pivotal moment. And to shake all cares and business from our age. There's actually a variant of our state rather than from our age. And as you can perhaps begin to see, these are wildly different in tone. Some are more neutral, some would be more personal, treating the division of the kingdom as a stately affair or perhaps family affair. Now, if you think about this, our fast intent, fast here is glossed on ISC as firmly fixed. And so the Folio's version seems to suggest Lear has a strong will, but the Quarto's first intent is less emotionally weighted. And so it's a kind of premeditated plan of action. This brings me to the theory behind our edition, which is that I am hoping students would have a rhizomatic reading experience. A rhizome is a plant-based metaphor. It is a kind of root. As you can see here, this is one rendition of the rhizome by the artist Richard Giblet. This can be found in the Galerie Düsseldorf. And unlike a typical kind of root, it doesn't have center or the peripheral. It is more like a spider's web. And so based on Deleuze and Guattari's theory of the rhizome in terms of cultural formation, I believe that reading is also a non-linear experience. It doesn't go necessarily from point A to point B. Between A and B, especially in today's digital culture, people tend to pause and wander off, perhaps look something up, perhaps you click a hyperlink. You may or may not return and continue your journey from point A to point B. And so the various lines in the playtext are merely activation points. They can serve as a portal, a starting point for discussion of nuances. And so the rhizomatic reading experience is not linear. It provides many opportunities for thought experiment. The folio text serves as a foundation for a particular print edition, while the Quarto lines are in gray type. They're flagged in the margin. And so the folio text is shorter, perhaps it's better suited for the stage, but it leaves out interesting passages. And so bringing them back through this kind of textual apparatus is innovative and can lead to a very different kind of classroom experience, where students are typically assigned one authoritative edition and you follow it through, and that's the story. But here there are multiple King Lear stories possible, and so variants reading focusing on the variants can enhance our understanding of the characters. The variants between Folio and Quarto are essentially doubled kisses and blessings. I believe that dramatic criticism thrives in the space of textual ambiguity. And so variants, they highlight once again the value of keeping ambiguity in literary and dramatic criticism. Directors see the multiplicity of meanings as an asset, as doubled kisses, as we learn in Antony and Cleopatra. An example of this kind of doubled kisses is the Lear in the storm scene. He storms off into the night. The lone Gloucester makes sympathetic observations. Alack, the night comes on, and the bleak winds do sorely ruffle. So there are many different possible ways to read this, as you can see on the screen here. So let us take it one by one. First, you have the Quarto version, as you can see, marked by Q, versus the Folio version marked by F. The Quarto seems more moody. And here I want to pause a bit and talk about the hot topic of our days now, that is generative AI. Essentially, a text like this is actually similar to text produced by generative AI as a text generative and recombination mechanism, right? It'll produce text that sound quite similar if you use similar prompts. And yet there are variations, there are variants within. So if you think about the Quarto version, the wind is bleak and it rustles through grasses, which evokes sound on a bare landscape. It says there's not a bush. The Folio, however, it has high wind over a ruffled landscape, over a disturbed and uneven landscape with scarce a bush. Big differences here, and it actually sets the scene quite differently in terms of whether it's a barren landscape, how harsh it is. And when you juxtapose these variants, instead of privileging one particular version over another, it is productive to allow variants some space to be in play with each other simultaneously in order to foreground the continuous process of textual and theatrical production. And so I find myself in agreement with Sonia Masai's editorial theory in preserving part of the early modern reading experiences, even though today, whenever we produce critical editions, it's invariably one bound volume, right? You can't say I have, text A, I have text B. It has to be all in one to be pragmatic. But there are many different ways to highlight possible pathways to other kinds of meanings. And so our Broadview edition creates what I might call structured abundance of variants. So there's abundance, but it is curated, it is structured, there are copious notes. You won't get lost in this forest if you choose to follow one particular path. But if you want to open other doors, they are there available for you. We wanted to promote the ability to handle complex domains and to embrace uncertainty and open-endedness, which I think is especially important in this era of AI, where more and more people tend to default to simplistic certainty. You ask a question, you want one answer, you want the answer. In some cases, such things do not exist. Perhaps it's not healthy to fetishize that. And so to be able to handle complex domains and complex situations is actually a very important ability. I also wanted to honor distracted attentiveness of the current student population. We have traditional kind of long-form attention. You sit there, listen to a lecture for an hour, where you sit down with a text, read it cover to cover. But increasingly, what we have is hyper-attention, kind of distracted attentiveness. You're attending to multiple things at once, with paying short attention to multiple items, kind of hopping around. There are a lot of pedagogical theories that are taking into account compulsory able-bodiedness and disability. And increasingly, researchers are finding that hyperattention or distracted attentiveness is not necessarily always negative, as traditional pedagogy will make them out to be, because it's simply a different way to relate to the world around you. And we need to honor the diversity as well as non-neurotypical ways of learning. So all in all, I hope this kind of experience with our edition can counter the fetishization of speed of reading and writing in an era of AI, basically bringing humanistic logic to counter corporate logic. Increasingly with AI, there is an emphasis of speed, doing things faster, but few would pause and ask about quality. Do you have a quality time encountering King Lear? I think there's value to slowing down, to pausing and thinking about variants as you go, rather than flipping through and tell me what happens in the story. I just want a plot summary. So on one hand, it is kind of a curated museum with many doors. On the other hand, my intention is to slow students down. Don't rush through the pages, because there are things to be savored. Now we come to other special features, especially the global performance history that I've prepared. The section is called Upon a Wheel of Fire, performing King Lear on stage and on screen. One question for anybody studying the performance history of King Lear is the assertions, right, repeatedly made by directors that King Lear is unstageable. Could tragedy be a bitter pill that cures social ills? Global performance histories show that King Lear is often appropriated to provide comfort, even though the tragedy carries a bleak outlook on human behaviors, with most of its key characters dead in the end without transcendental meanings. The play's vivid imagery of hell is captured in King Lear's lines about his torture. He says that he feels as if though he's bound upon a wheel of fire, that my own tears do scald like molten lead. Some Anglophone critics and directors have repeatedly declared the play unstageable due to its cruel and nihilistic vision. Charles Lamb maintained that it was torturous to see an old man tottering about the stage with a walking stick turned out of doors by his daughters on a rainy night. Samuel Johnson argued that the blinding of Gloucester was too horrid to be endured in dramatic exhibition. Even those directors who admire the play's philosophical depth spoke of its resistance to performance. Peter Brook believed that King Lear was a mountain whose summit had never been reached. On the way up, one found the shattered bodies of other climbers strewn on every side. King Lear would not seem an intuitive choice for a companion in times of crisis, even though it is exactly the features that I outlined here that drew artists and audiences who are seeking various forms of reassurance in difficult times. Anglophone directors may seem more hesitant. Directors in other cultures, they do readily embrace King Lear, which has an illustrious afterlife around the world. King Lear has been frequently appropriated to reassure audiences of their pre-existing beliefs about humanity during global crisis, despite, or perhaps because of, its lack of closure, as captured by Kent's comment upon Lear's death. Vex not his ghost, let him pass. In fact, during the global pandemic of COVID-19 from 2020 to 2022, even Anglophone popular culture started to gravitate towards the play through memes and quotes. On Shakespeare's birthday, April 23rd in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, Canada's Stratford Festival kicked off their online film festival with artistic director Anthony Cimolino's 2014 production of King Lear, which went on to become their most watched video. As Arthur Frank writes in reflection of how Shakespeare's text counsels, King Lear takes us into its own half Elizabethan and half out of time elsewhere. We can move around in that space and vicariously experience shifts of identity, lingering for a while in that Shakespearean elsewhere can enable us to return to our own world with changed perception of what life confronts us with. The first approach to social reparation is informed by the assumption that the dramatic situations exemplify moral universals. King Lear can inscribe psychic tensions in times of crisis. These inscriptions provide raw material for artists and audiences to work through in order to achieve reparation. Earnest performances posit that reparative efficacy of the arts can improve the actors' and audiences' social circumstances. Some directors consciously offer a corrective to Shakespearean narratives and to local genres of performance by ameliorating some characters' conditions and by shedding a new light on artistic conventions. And so sometimes Shakespeare is imagined to have a reparative effect on the artist or a society's outlook on life. The second approach to social reparation is exemplified by adaptations that problematize heteronormativity and psychological universals in liberal humanist visions of the canon. This approach is self-conscious of deeply contextual meanings of Shakespeare. As a result, it lends itself to the genre of parody, meta-theater, and meta-cinema. It exposes the contradictions in liberal humanism, which naturalizes what has been erroneously perceived as universally reparative. This approach challenges the therapeutic, sometimes self-help ethos. In contrast to more earnest pursuits of remedial Shakespeare, some adaptations, they mark the conviction that Shakespeare has any recuperative function in hybrid cultural spaces. So let's take a quick look. Some adaptations use Shakespeare's speeches as therapy for characters. In The Last Lear, which is inspired by a play, there is an eccentric aging stage actor in Kolkata, and Harry Mishra reenacts scenes of the plays he used to perform. In the final scene, Shabna comes to visit Harry and wakes him from a coma by reading lines from the reconciliation scene of King Lear. An actress herself and an admirer of Harry, Shabna slips into the role of Cordelia, while Harry dies reciting the lines he knows by heart. You are a spirit, I know. Where have I been? I know not what to say. I am a very foolish, fond old man. It is a scene of reconciliation and self-recognition because in his career, Harry was ill-suited for the transition from stage to screen. Lear's speech here is repackaged and deployed to help Harry express regret, apology, and self-pity. Similar to this, you have John Canny's Kunene and the King, which is directed by Janice Honeyman and co-produced by the RSC and Fugard Theatre, South Africa. It is performed by John Canny and Anthony Scher. The play depicts how characters come to terms with aging, cultural biases, and their own mortality through situations that parallel those in King Lear. And so they reenact different scenes from the play. Kunene and the King features Lunga, a South African black male nurse, and Jack, an ill-tempered white actor coping with terminal liver cancer in South Africa. Throughout the play, they recite passages from Lear to expose each other's cultural biases and eventually reconcile their differences. One of the most iconic scenes, of course, is the division of the kingdom. Performances of this scene reflect the reaction of each culture and generation to the challenging ethical burden within the play. After the UK's 2016 referendum to leave the European Union, directors and readers turned to King Lear as a Brexit play, a play about division and dispossession, with the map as its central prop in the opening scene. In Richard Eyre's film, for example, Anthony Hopkins' exiled King Lear finds himself in pouring rain in a refugee camp, and he becomes an unaccommodated man. So the film, of course, alludes to the issues of migration and the refugee crisis in Europe. In the post-Brexit context, there is dramatic irony in Lear's decision to cut familial and political ties with Cordelia, only to see her return from France to save him briefly from oblivion. Now, the scene of regal abdiction of King Lear is folkloric in origin. Structurally, when the scene begins, there are other divisions paralleling Lear's announcement: Cordelia versus her elder sisters, and Edgar in opposition to Edmund. Of course, the Gloucester family and the Lear family are also parallels. Lear asks his daughter to publicly confess their love for him and their loyalty to the throne. This is a highly performative act, which makes the scene dramatic and memorable. As a nonconformist, Cordelia refuses to play along, even if Lear makes it clear the game is rigged in her favor. What can you say to draw a third more opulent than your sisters? So, in studying the performance history, I began asking a number of questions. Is this division of the kingdom a ceremony with more symbolic than substantive meaning? In other words, is it a ritual? Or is it a premeditated act of policy, right? That's disguised as a public test of true love, but it's already it's a policy that's already been decided on. So, can the scene contribute to an effective reparative reading, or does the scene dictate a more coldly political enterprise? In Belarus Free Theatre's production of King Lear at the World Shakespeare Festival in London in 2012, Lear becomes both the volatile, capricious monarch and the clown in the very first scene. Teasing audience expectations, the production amplifies the folkloric and comedic textures of Shakespeare's tragedy. Alice Joubin's Lear emerges hunched over in long white hair. He slips, but as he falls, he whisks off his wigs and laughs at the audience in a gotcha moment. Old age is traditionally the most sacred and horrifying element of the play, but old age is now turned inside out, because the King Lear toys with the audience's perception of old age in this parody. We also have, from Japan, Akira Kurosawa's samurai film, Ran, which means chaos, was made in 1985. This film features some elements of merriment in the scene as well. Warlord Hidetora decides to retire but retain his title of Great Lord. Against counsel, Hidetora divides his kingdom and among his three sons, Taro, Jiro, and Saburo, but asks them to remain united to defend the clan from invaders. Kurosawa frames the scene of division in the historical feudal lord Mori Motonari's parable with a twist, known as the Legend of the Three Arrows. The story depicts an aging father who demonstrates the power of a united front to his three sons to teach his sons a lesson in unity. In the film, Hidetora gives each son an arrow and tells him to break it, an action which they accomplish with ease. Hidetora then gives each a bundle of arrows, which the two elder sons are unable to break. Saburo, the youngest, ever the odd one out, breaks the bundle of arrows over his knees to burst the bubble of his aging father's delusional plan. His acts of defiance suggest that his father's childish fable is not suited for adults in a feudal world. It also highlights the irony in Hidetora's delusional and self-congratulatory lecture that calls for both the division and unification of his kingdom. From the National Theatre of Iceland, we have Lear Konungur, it's a King Lear, directed by Benedict Andrews. And this 2010 production featured hundreds of balloons on stage. This really calls to mind American political conventions, especially if you look at the colors of the balloons in this photo. The characters are milling around in conservative contemporary business attire on an otherwise bare stage. This is set in the contemporary period, and the production critiques neoliberal free market capitalism driven by corporate interests. For many modern directors, King Lear is a narrative about the undoing of the patriarchy. Another pivotal scene is Lear in the storm on the heath in Ran, which places its characters firmly among the animals and frequently in an epic natural landscape. Hidetora often asks where he is. He does not seem to be as invested in who he might be. Drawing on one single line by Goneril, when he returns from hunting, I will not speak with him. Kurosawa's Ran presents a lavish, extended opening scene of boar hunting. This is one of the few performances of Lear to open with a scene in nature. It has become a critical commonplace to read King Lear's journey as that of an unaccommodated animal. The wild boar is a metaphor for Hidetora's degeneration from the hunter to the hunted. However, the film's Buddhist framework hints at Hidetora's reincarnation in the form of a boar after death. The line between humanity and the natural world is more porous and permeable in Shinto Buddhism. I want to conclude by talking briefly about how natural elements are brought onto the stage. Most Western performances have King Lear call on wind gods and water spouts, beings who are banished to the edge of the early modern world. He calls on them to reclaim the world that has lost its way. Some Lears rage on in a competition with thunder, while others are weakened by the storm and express their frustration. Donald Sinden whispered the lines as a quiet invocation in the 1976 Royal Shakespeare Company production, directed by Trevor Nunn. The emptiness of the heath parallels Lear's reduction to nothingness. The raging storm echoes the internal storm in Lear's mind. Now, a lot of stage productions that depict the storm scene metonymically. In the Icelandic production that I mentioned earlier, torrential rain actually dominated the stage. Actors were drenched by 9 tons of water for over half an hour. As actors and their characters endured the discomfort, their suffering was conveyed to the live audiences. And so this is the power of live theater is quite different from cinema. A frustrated aside about a storm that is already there is quite different from calling for a storm to take place. And so these are important directorial decisions when it comes to King Lear in the storm. In a Korean version, for example, called Uruwan, King Wuru, He states explicitly that spirits in heaven heard my petition as the rain starts to fall. So these are kind of different approaches to how to stage the storm scene. In conclusion, exploring the performance history of King Lear in a global context, as well as paying attention to textual variants, will give us insight into aspects of the play that lend themselves to open interpretation. The complex and intertwined themes in King Lear offer room for both intellectual and emotional responses to the play. The global reception history of Lear reveals the limit of the popularized universal notion of tragedy, and all the textual variants demonstrate the play's capacity to speak to cultures far removed politically and historically from early modern England. Thank you all for joining me to explore all of these special features of the broad view King Lear. I hope you would pick up a copy and explore the textual and performative variants. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexa. That was very thought-provoking.